All right. Hey, what a start. So everything seems to be working for now. All right. So my aim here today is to finish talking about discursive or discourse analysis or content analysis. Totally try to move through stuff really quickly. At U of A, even the whiteboard erasers are broken, right? It's like, can we glue this back together? Oh my goodness. Oh, everything is broken. Okay. Yeah, so we're going to try to get through content analysis, finish that up today, and then move on to, if we get to it, talking a little bit about mixed methods. We'll definitely get into mixed methods on Tuesday at the very latest. So we should be okay. We don't have a ton of slides left here, but it could take a second. All right, so I mean, sorry, let me just slow my brain down for half a sec. My childcare for this week has been entirely shut down because my childcare worker's children infected her with viral plague. And so they've been sick all week. So I've been driving my 4-year-old to my parents in St. Albert. And I live on the south side. So I've been driving to St. Albert every day and then back here. So I'm like a little discombobulated. I'm like, maybe I should buy my parents a house next door or something. That'd be helpful. Actually, no, wait. That's a terrible idea for a lot of reasons. This week it would have been useful. Next week, not so much. Anyway, so I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of it. Okay, so just, I guess, a couple really simple things. Again, if you haven't looked at your major lab 1, do have a look at it. If you have any questions you want to ask about it, right, make an appointment with me and we can go over it, right? Like I said last time, do look at the rubric if you want to kind of, say, I think I deserved a little bit more here and this is why, and say, look, I think I meet this descriptor in the rubric better than I think what you evaluated me as. And especially like if Celine is the one that did your evaluation, right? And you'll know because she put comments in and it has her name in it. And her comments, start with great work on this. Mine start with overall, single one. I always write overall as the first word. We can talk about where maybe you think there's some space to get a higher grade, and don't worry about it. Like, I'm not going to lower your grade if you come and talk to me, so you don't have to worry that I'm going to if Celine did yours and you're like, oh, maybe Professor Broussard will mark me lower. I won't do that. That's terrible. Worst comes to worst, you get nothing, right? Your grade stays the same. So if you want to come, but just be prepared so we can try to do the conversation quickly, without me having to reread the whole thing. And you can just be like, I think this deserves more here for this reason. Boom, done. Okay. So we're talking about discourse analysis last time. So we did a bunch, right? We looked at some semiotics last time. We looked at, Roland Barthes' whole connotation, denotation myth kind of formation. And we ended off talking about some discourse analysis. Okay. Gill. All right. So Gill, what does Gill say? Basically, that discourse can be, you can think of it as being, there's 4 themes in discourse analysis, right? 4 kind of ways that it can work. Okay. So discourse as a topic in itself, right? So that's kind of what I was talking about last time. The way that language is used, the way that it interacts with ideas, the way it constitutes the way we think, right? It can be discourse can be a topic in and of itself. Language as constructive. So language as building reality, right? So think of this in the kind of Peter Berger social constructivist kind of maybe even symbolic interactionist way of thinking about it, right? That language is constructing our reality as we use it, right? So that's one way that we can think of, discourse analysis being used. All right, discourse as a form of action, right? So when someone makes a statement, right, and this is a very Foucauldian way in some ways of thinking about it. Like, what is someone trying to do in terms of making a set of truth claims, right? Like, there's something that you're trying to accomplish with discourse, right? So if someone is engaging in a discourse of whatever, right? Of, a feminist discourse, right? They're trying to achieve something, right? They're trying to achieve the emancipation of women or whatever, right? But discourse is a form of action, right? When you're using kind of discursive strategies, you're doing something, right? And you're trying to accomplish something. All right, and then discourse being rhetorically organized, right? So discourses are typically arguments, right? So they're arguments, again, towards a goal, right? But they're organized in a sort of structure, right? To make a certain point. And so you can look at how they're organized and how they're kind of making a particular point, right? So it's like, you could do this in very mechanical ways, right? So if you think of discourse as kind of rhetorically organized, you could take someone's truth claim and break it into a syllogism, right? And say, how are syllogisms organized? God, it's been a long time since philosophy. It's, you basically have two propositions and then, kind of a conclusion. You see if it follows, right? So this is I don't know. Sorry. I'm trying to think of how this would work, but the only example I can think of is the old kind of philosophy argument of proving that Aristotle is mortal, right? Aristotle's a man, all men are mortal, therefore Aristotle is mortal, right? The kind of rhetoric that applies the way that an argument is structured. Yeah. Peter Berger. He's just a social constructivist, right? So that's going back to point number 2. Right, so this idea that we organize and understand our experiences through language and linguistic construct, right, that themselves sort of create the world that we live in. So that's how we understand it. We can't understand anything outside of language, right? We've been talking about that a lot in Source of Religion. Okay. All right, are we good with this? Okay. Yeah, looking at discourse analysis, you can also look at strategies. So, for example, how people produce facts, right? So how you end up with something being, turning into a factual statement or a statement that people accept as fact, right? So, quantification rhetoric. So anytime that you see someone using a sort of quantification, right, you can say that this is probably a rhetoric or a strategy of producing facts, right? So, and you can analyze what they're doing in this kind of scenario, right? So, statements involving numbers or quantities are made to support or refute arguments, using variations in numbers to highlight contrast, right? So you can kind of think of how this typically works, right? If you wanted to, I was having a conversation with a student about this the other day, talk about the fact that Canadian social attitudes have changed significantly since 2005, right? You could say, in 2005, public opinion polling showed that if same-sex marriage had been put to a popular referendum, 66% of the population would have voted against it. And today, if you put the same question to the voters, only 15% of Canadians would vote against, making same-sex marriage legal. So we can say that Canadians have become much more progressive on issues of sexuality than in the past, right? So I'm attempting there in this kind of rhetorical moment, basically to, produce a kind of fact or support an argument about, the political views of Canadians, right? And I'm using quantities, right? So I'm using opinion polling in this case, but you can use a lot of different kinds of quantity to do this sort of work. And you can think of how these other things work, right? Variations in number to highlight a contrast. I just did that as well, right? Contrasting past opinions with present opinions, right? Again, to make an argument about change over time. You could use this between countries, right? You could say, 80 or 99% of Canadians believe, girls should be allowed to go to school compared to 4% of Afghans. I don't know if that's actually the number. I'm just making that number up, right? Something like that, right? Okay, so variations in number to highlight contrasts of something. Okay, attention to specific details, emphasize supportive evidence to the argument, right? So you can imagine how this works, right? Instead of where you wouldn't draw a contrast is like, Canadians are very progressive. 90% of them support universal and free medical care for Canadians, right? So emphasize just a supportive argument, again, using a kind of quantification in that case. Or, you could, producing facts, you might not need to use, or attention to specific details, you might not even need to use specific quantities. But, just highlight specific pieces of evidence to support some fact or something that you're trying to argue, right? I'm trying to think of what an example of this would be. Even just around like a question of if you wanted to argue, say, for reduction or more electric cars, you could say, look at Los Angeles, right? Los Angeles is a city that has consistent smog problems caused by the number of automobiles. And this would be alleviated by electrification and fewer people driving, cars that spew CO2, right? So that would be, a specific detail, smog, right, that you're using to make an argument for a position you want. Attention to rhetorical. Rhetorical. I just had a funny thought. Sorry, there's this guy on YouTube, Loic Superville, and he always pretends to be different languages talking to each other. He's often talking French, asking English how to pronounce things, and looking at rhetoric. It just made me think of it. It's like, he'll contrast like different things that are, what are some of the words that sound the same, but are spelled completely different, like bow and bow, like B-O-W and B-O-U-G-H. And it's funny because French is like, and people say I'm confusing. And so when I saw rhetorical and I couldn't pronounce it, I thought of Loic. Okay, so attention to rhetorical detail. This would be a kind of analysis of how arguments are constructed to make, a convincing argument, right? Or discount a possible counter argument. There's a whole school when you go into, say, like a school of communications or sometimes faculty of English, there can be whole programs in rhetoric, right? Like essentially how to make a good argument. And sometimes like there's a lot of interesting ways, that you can do kind of discourse analysis on rhetoric and how people actually construct arguments in order to be convincing and to discount possible counter arguments. The one that's jumping to my mind here, and it's always kind of interesting, right? I don't know where I ran across it lately. I think it was just in YouTube Shorts, but there's a guy, his name is Lawrence Krauss. He's a physicist. And he's popular kind of in internet circles for making a lot of anti-religious arguments, right? Like he's one of what they might call the new atheists. An interesting guy, and I met him once. He's a fun guy, heavy drinker though. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's not anything to do with what I'm saying. But he got drunk as a skunk. Anyway, what was I saying about Krauss? One of the things that I saw in this internet clip, Krauss was arguing something about, homosexuality and how, we find homosexuality in a lot of animal species. And so it's irrational that religious groups like Christians or Jews or Muslims, would, basically prohibit homosexuality because it appears in the natural world, right? So there's a rhetorical strategy there that you could analyze, right? It's that linking of kind of human sexuality to nature, right? That's a rhetorical strategy, that everything is perfectly natural. And then he kind of stepped in and did a sort of counter, or I think drive it home or discount a possible counter argument. And he's like, so why would we take, the word of a bunch of Bronze Age savages who didn't know anything about the world, right? Because we know stuff because we have the scientific method. So he's sort of precluding in that any kind of counter argument that, someone from a religious point of view would have based on a holy book. Because he's like, those holy books are bunk, they don't align with science, off we go to the races, right? Now, whatever you think of that argument, some people like it, some people don't. You can kind of see that in that kind of retort, he's making an argument, and then he's going to an appeal to almost a kind of emotion or an appeal to empiricism as a way of discounting any possible counter argument. You'll sometimes see academics doing this too, right? Where academics will have like, well, I have a PhD and you don't, which is a kind of argument from authority. Or this person, like Foucault told us, right, as a sort of rhetorical strategy to pump up whatever they're saying, right? If you can cite a bunch of studies. Oh, the citing of studies, right? When people want to make a point, rhetorically, it's like, studies have shown, or this study by Smith and Smith and Smith and Smith, or in this case, Smith et al. The Smiths. Sorry, little very in the weeds academic humor there. This kind of like rhetorical strategy of saying there's a study, right? You can analyze that using kind of discourse analysis and say that this person is making their argument, right? They're basing it on authority, and this is how they're constructing their argument to support their own point. Okay. Probably enough said about producing facts and all that fun jazz. Okay. Critical discourse analysis. This is, I guess if you break it down, you see this a lot in kind of conflict theory schools. When people are looking at discourses, and they do kind of what I described Foucault as doing, right? Looking for where, power, issues of power, hierarchies, structural inequalities, historical political struggles show up in discourse, right? Foucault obviously is the master class in this, in like looking historically at how different ways of talking produced different sorts of authority, right? The church, had authority, and then science came in, and then doctors and scientists had authority, right? And they got to produce the facts, and it was good for these people, and it was bad for these other people, right? Some people ended up being oppressed as a result. Some people ended up being, lifted up or put into positions of privilege. This you kind of hear almost on a daily basis, right? When you hear any kind of discussions out of, say, critical race theory, this is in a lot of cases where they're, dissecting, discourses that they see as privileging whiteness or whatever it happens to be, right? Or critical feminism does this a lot. Discourses that privilege the patriarchy, right? All of this is what critical discourse analysis is kind of doing. I think does that explain it well enough? Have you all seen, I'm sure you're all sociology students, you've all seen this done like a quadrazillion times. Okay. Oh, right. Conversation analysis. Or boring yourself to death while listening to other people. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't preface it with such negative comments. Conversation analysis. So conversation analysis is another form of kind of content analysis. And it's basically, sorry, I sigh because I've never actually really seen anyone do this. It's not really that hard to understand, but basically you're looking at the structure of talk, right? So rather than say discourse analysis, where you're maybe looking at things at a pretty high meta level, like Foucault does, like how did all of the literature on madness contribute to our idea? Conversation analysis is at the very micro level, right? Talk between people and how basically it shapes kind of the way people communicate and what the meanings are, the subtle meanings are in the way people communicate, right? Okay, so things like, indexality. So in doing conversation analysis, you might do things like looking at pauses and sounds that have meaning that depend on the context in which they exist, right? So, when someone, you're having a conversation and someone kind of stops, right? Like maybe they pause to think, right? Or they make a sound like, oh, or, you would like basically note that down in conversation analysis to kind of talk about, well, what do those sounds mean? How are people like, say, putting in the word into conversations to give themselves time to think, right? Or, this kind of thing, right? Pauses, sounds, in the context that they exist, what do they actually mean? Because there's lots of things in speech that are actually not words that we use in all sorts of ways to convey meaning to other people. So that would be, what indexality does. Pauses, sounds that have meaning depending on the context. Okay, reflexivity. Basically the examination of how social order is created through communication. So social order is an achievement, not an objective of pre-existing phenomena. So this basically, like reflexivity, in looking at speech or conversation reflexively, you might be looking at how people kind of try to assert control in conversations, right? How, just in talking, certain dynamics are kind of created, right? So for example, like a classroom, right? Like you could do this kind of reflexive thing in a classroom where you look at how, say, a back and forth goes between students and a teacher, right? And what that sort of says about how one person is constructing, the social order in that space, right? So if we did, a conversation like this, where I ask you questions and you respond, there's a certain sort of social order that's created, right? Obviously, I'm in charge and you are kind of, in some sense, subordinate to me. But if we went in and did sort of groups, right? I put you all in like little circles and you're all talking to each other and I just kind of pop in and chat with the different groups at different times, then those conversations end up with a different social order, right? Maybe in your group, one person sort of establishes themselves as the group leader and kind of creates a social order around that. Family dynamics can be, kind of analyzed like this, like, family dinner conversations, how parents structure kind of talk at the table for all of those things. Blinky blink. I'm now like afraid when this thing blinks on me that it's going to fail because they just spent 10 minutes fixing it. Okay. So conversation analysis. I honestly think it's quite dull for the most part, and I wouldn't suggest anyone do it. I've seen a lot, I guess where I've seen this done is in like linguistics, right? In linguistics, you might see this kind of thing done. I don't know that I've ever seen it in sociology, because it's just not the kind of questions we're interested in. But definitely like a qualitative research tradition, responds in context, how things are happening in particular context, to gain a contextual understanding and a construction. It has a constructionist ontology because it assumes that social situations are generated out of a particular social context and ways of speaking, right? And I mean, typically it's naturally occurring settings, right? You're looking at trying to analyze people's natural conversations. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so basically, sometimes I guess it could be linked to quantitative research. You could, do kind of the fine-grained details of talk, right? I could see, like, say, almost like a structured observation kind of fitting in with conversation analysis and doing both, right? So you could do, like, if you remembered structured observation, right? It had the chart, right? So that someone was noting down a code in every, 3 seconds of speech. It was like for 15 minutes or something, or 10 seconds of speech in 15 minutes, right? It's like, in this 15-second interval, a joke was told. That is code 3. And in this one, a joke was, or a laugh was had. That is a code 4, right? I always love the codes that are there. It's like tension was diffused. Always things that you can tell externally. So you could have quantitative research going in, fine-grained details of talk could fit into like structured observation. And so, counting words that are used, phrases that are used, you could have this sort of thing. So you could link, say, conversation analysis with some of those other content strategies that are quantitative. It does come with, a bunch of assumptions, among which is talk is structured, right? There's an order to speech and the way people talk to it, and there's social norms that are kind of expressed through the way we talk to each other. Talk is forged contextually, right? So basically, things happen within a certain social context. If you took it to a different one, right? If you are having a conversation with your friend around coffee at Starbucks, that conversation is going to look very different than if you come to my office and we're talking about something academic, right? We're going to have a different sort of interaction. And yeah, analysis should be grounded in data and observation. Okay. Okay, one more on, sorry, conversation. I thought that was the last one on conversation analysis. I got one more. Okay. Other things, characteristics of how talk is organized in conversation analysis. So things that you can look at, turn taking, right? So how do people talking to each other naturally sort of progress, right? So like if I'm talking, if we're talking, is it proceeding in like clear order? Like, I say something to Josie says something back to me. I interrupt Josie, right? Like you can analyze this kind of turn taking to say, okay, this is how like the power dynamics in this kind of relationship or in this conversation, right? Question asking, right? Am I asking questions? What's that? And she's answering them. What's going on? What's the turn taking like, right? Okay. If I say something like, do you want to join me for coffee afterwards? And she just doesn't answer because it's awkward and professor shouldn't be asking a student to go out for coffee, right? Then it's like, oh, then she forfeit her turn. What does that mean, right? Those are the kinds of things you would do in conversation analysis. Adjacency pairs, how talk moves between the parties, questions, answers, like what's the dynamic, who's asking questions, who's responding to them, all of these sorts of things, right? Are that's called adjacency pairs. How conversations proceed. If I ask a question of someone and they don't answer, what does that mean? If I ask a question, and they turn around or Josie asked me a question, right? And she's like, what does it mean, turn taking? And I'm like, well, what do you think it means, right? Those are the kind like if it goes in this proceeding of question, right? These are the kinds of things that you look at when you're looking at at adjacency pairs, how it moves between parties. Is one person asking questions, the other person answering? Are people asking each other questions? Am I answering questions with more questions, right? All of this would be how you would kind of work with this kind of data. Preference organization, preferred responses and non-preferred responses. Non-preferred responses require a justification, right? So if I ask my wife, do you want to go out for Thai food, right? And my preferred answer would be yes, let's go for Thai food. But she answers, no, I don't like Thai food, which doesn't. I knew there was something wrong with her when I married her. I'm just kidding. Non-preferred responses, do they just sit there or do they require a justification, right? How are people like proceeding through non-preferred responses? So, no, I don't want to go eat Thai food. It gives me heartburn, right? These are the kinds of things. Or, I don't want to go for coffee. I'm too tired, right? Or, whatever it happens to be. All that fun stuff. Okay. Yeah, so conversation analysis, structured analysis of talk, right? Cultural context and explaining, might not be permitted. It's just like, so you wouldn't be like, oh, in Canada it's more like what's happening directly in the conversation. How is the immediate context, say the power relationships between the people, important without kind of, reference to larger cultural context. Examination of the structure and history of the talk itself. So just the conversation between people, maybe with reference to past conversations, if that's something you have access to as well. Okay, like I said, I think this is much more of a linguistics kind of way of thinking about stuff. And I've never seen it done in sociology, but it could. I haven't read everything in sociology. Okay, so what are the advantages of content analysis? It's very transparent, right? Check mark. So, when you're doing content analysis, right, you will tell, and you're writing it up, you will tell people what you did, what you found, what you saw in a particular text. So it's very transparent and it's very easy for people to either agree or disagree, to redo the content analysis and all of that stuff. It can allow for longitudinal analysis very easily, right? You can study, say, if you're looking at discourse analysis in kind of Foucault's way, you can go back centuries, right? You can look at discourses that have been around for hundreds of years or decades or a long time, any kind of span of time. You can look at it very easily because you're taking stuff that's pre-existing and out in the world, right? So it's easy to do longitudinal analysis. It's unobtrusive. You never have to worry about, reactivity because, you just don't. Flexible, right? It can be used with lots of different kinds of unstructured information, right? So you can take newspapers, you can take journals, you can take TV shows, you can take conversations, right? There's lots of different things you can use, interviews, all this sorts of stuff. And yeah, there's no real barrier to research access for the most part, right? Because if it's available as a text, you can research it, despite the fact that maybe you're reading someone from the 18th century's diary. Okay. Disadvantages, right? Some of the text analyzed, right? There are potential sort of problems, right, with authenticity, credibility, and representativeness. It's very subjective as well, right? So when you go, there can be intercoder or intracoder unreliability. How you interpret content in a lot of ways can be very subjective. And so two people, I think I talked about this, I was talking about Stuart Hall, right? Two people may read things completely differently, and that goes for the researcher as well, right? So, very subjective. And so people often think of it as much more artsy and a little bit less rigorous. There's potential for invalid conjectures, especially if you're talking about latent messages, right? But your interpretation may not be correct. And certainly, the problem of interpretation is really difficult to solve because everybody's going to come at it with a little bit of a different lens and say two people may look at the same text and come to totally different conclusions. Why questions and using this method can be really difficult to answer, right? Like you might see something, I don't know, if you're looking at Hollywood movies of the 1950s, you might observe that, women are locked into particular gender roles. The why could be very difficult to answer because you don't have access to the minds of the creators. It could be, emphasis on measurement might make it atheoretical. It can be hard to theorize on content analysis, right? To create a theory, because all you're doing is sort of the interpretation, right? So it can be difficult to make theories about content analysis. Certainly grand theories are really difficult. Middle range theories can be a little bit more possible, but I think, I don't know, I'll tell you, media studies, one of the things that people have done is they've really wanted to combine content analysis with interviewing in media studies to get a better sense of what's going on, the why question, and to move towards the ability to form some middle range theories. Okay, that's it for content analysis. How am I doing for time? Way too much time left. Okay, we got like 40 minutes left. I will discard my beautiful doodles. Okay. Sorry, I just put this up this morning. It is on eClass. Why don't we start talking about mixed methods, and we'll keep going into that next week. Can't believe it's Thursday already. Where does the time go? Mixed methods. All right, let's talk mixed methods. Okay, so mixed methods. Now I have... the battery on my little walkie is about to die. Oh well. Maybe I'll switch this to the microphone on my computer as I'm here. I keep forgetting to recharge this thing. And I'll just stand close to the computer so we don't lose it. Because then I get... It's like the audio stopped. It didn't stop in class. Why don't you come to class? All right. I'm kidding. I'm joking. Okay. Trust me, I was just as loud in class as ever. Okay, so... battery on the case is dead. That's why. Mixed methods. Now, I have friends who I've had... This is how nerdy I am. I've had not violent, but heated arguments as to whether we should use the term mixed method or multiple method, and which one is best. Now, my friend Dorothy will make the case that mixed method is a stupid term because you're not actually mixing the methods in any way for the most part, right? It's very rare that you're going to do like, you're taking your quantitative data and then using a qualitative form of analysis on it. That's not super common. And she says what you're doing typically is multiple methods, right? You're doing surveys that inform your interviews, or interviews that dig into things that you found on your survey. So not mixed, but multiple methods. And I think she has a point. But I mean, it's typically referred to, in the field as mixed method studies. Okay, so this is where, I guess in some ways, the whole structure of the course kind of breaks down for a second, because it's been very much split. Like the first half of the course was all quantitative research. The second half of the course is all qualitative research. Mixed methods is essentially about finding a way to make both of them work together, right? So quantitative, qualitative, they can have a lot in common. And I guess the idea behind kind of doing mixed method studies is typically that you want to use the strengths of each to get a more complete picture of the social world, right? So it kind of it relies on us essentially having sort of an idea of what the strengths and weaknesses of both kinds of research are, and then using them to kind of fill in the gaps, right? So quantitative can be really good at figuring out big social trends, especially when you're talking survey research, but it really struggles with the why question, right? That why question, like, why is this happening? Why do people think this? Why are people acting in this way? It can be really difficult to kind of get that degree of causation, right? The why question. Sorry, this is going to sound weird. I was just reading this morning a study. I've been reading it for a couple days, which was basically kind of trying to figure out what the relationship between pornography use and secularization was, right? So basically, these scholars were looking at, we know, because we've had a lot of research that suggests this, that the more pornography young people consume, the less likely they are to be religious. There's two kind of possible directionalities for this. Either religious, young people consume less because of their religion, or, and this was the theory of the paper, increased pornography usage actually will cause people to become less religious over time. And that's sort of what they were proposing. And they tested it with a bunch of statistical models. And then in the discussion and conclusion portion of the paper, they're like, yes, we think that we found in the data this possible, causal or a correlative relationship between, pornography use and declining religiosity. But, we don't have a really clear sense of why this would be the case. Like, we theorize that it could be, cognitive dissonance that happens with, religious youth. They start to use pornography. And then it kind of, they feel guilty about it. They feel like it doesn't fit their religious mindset. So they withdraw from religion. But they're like, we really don't know. And what we actually, they didn't say this, but this is sort of implied. What we actually need to do is qualitative research to go and actually talk to people. That's always fun, qualitative research about pornography, but it does happen. People are super eager to talk about it. They are not. But, we need the qualitative research in order to establish why people would interpret themselves as moving through this trajectory, right? And this is really what's at stake with mixed methods, is like the quant part tells you something, right? It can tell you, hey, there's a relationship between these two variables. And we often sort of assume, and this is what the authors of this particular paper were saying, we assume that, the dependent and independent variables are these, but sometimes we might get that wrong if we don't actually ask people about their experiences, right? So to my mind, and this is like when I've constructed research studies, I've always wanted them to be kind of both qual-quant, right? And I think the best research studies that I've ever seen are always these qualitative, quantitative kind of combinations. Now, typically, the most common one is survey research and interviews because they seem to pair really nicely together. But survey research and ethnography I've seen done as well. Okay. Right. So anyway, certain epistemological and ontological positions might be associated with particular research methods. Yeah, we talked about that at the beginning of the course. Okay. So multi-strategy research. But yeah, basically, work, is what I'm talking about. Work that integrates quantitative and qualitative approaches, sometimes referred to as mixed or multiple method research. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that probably distinguishes like mixed method from, say, hard qual or hard quant is that people who do these sort of mixed methods will typically be a little bit fuzzier about their epistemological and ontological kind of assumptions, right? And in a sense, you kind of have to be, because say like you're a hard quant person, right? And you've got this very empiricist epistemology that says there's a real social world out there that we can observe and that we can measure, and that's why I'm choosing, this quantitative method. Versus, someone who's doing a qualitative method is like, I think things are mostly kind of socially constructed in their natures. And so, I'm really interested in how people construct their own experiences. When you're doing mixed methods, in a sense, you almost have to put that to the one side, like not come down in a sort of hard place in that debate to basically say, look, each of these, because you end up saying essentially this, each of these methodologies brings us different sorts of information that's going to make for a richer study at the end of the day, and just sort of skirt the epistemological and ontological questions as to whether you think things are socially constructed or you think that, there's a hard social reality out there to measure. Okay. Ooh, a little video. Let's watch a little video.
This is Frances Chumney with a quick introduction to mixed methods research. Mixed methods is a research approach that attempts to answer a research question through the collection and analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data. Two important characteristics of a mixed method study are the research questions and design. While the research questions inform what we are trying to learn about a phenomenon, they also inform the design that is selected to carry out the study. Generally speaking, a mixed method study based on an explanatory or exploratory research question will use a sequential design, which means that either the quantitative or qualitative data will be collected first, and then the other data will be collected. Similarly, a convergent research question typically calls for a concurrent design in which the quantitative and qualitative data are collected at about the same time. There are three types of mixed methods research questions: explanatory, exploratory, and convergent. All three types of questions rely on both quantitative and qualitative data, but the three differ in the order in which data are collected. The three types of mixed methods research questions also differ in how the quantitative and qualitative data are used once they have been collected. When the research question is explanatory mixed methods, the quantitative data are collected first. The qualitative data are generally collected after the quantitative data and are meant to serve the purpose of providing explanations for the results of the quantitative data. With this type of research question, the qualitative and quantitative data are collected at different times, but they work together to answer the same research question. When the research question is exploratory mixed methods, the qualitative data are collected first. The qualitative data are analyzed and the results are used to inform the collection of the quantitative data. With this type of research question, the qualitative and quantitative data are collected at different times, but they work together to answer the same research question. When the research question is convergent mixed methods, the quantitative and qualitative data can be collected at about the same time and are then used together to triangulate the findings and answer the research question. One of the challenges researchers face is the extent to which they can or should be confident in the results of a study. One of the best ways to increase a researcher's confidence in their findings is to provide evidence of the validity of the results. Triangulation is the practice of doing just that, drawing the same conclusion from more than one data set. Triangulation can be done with as few as 2 data sets or with as many data sets as a researcher can collect. One reason triangulation is so powerful is that the different data sets do not have to include the same data collected from different groups or the same data collected at different times. The data could be collected from different groups or at different points in time, but the data could also be collected using different data collection methods, different modes of data collection, or the data itself could differ across sets. The distinction between mixed methods research and multiple methods research is often mistakenly overlooked. This error is understandable, though, given the inconsistency with which research terminology is used across various fields. The two terms are not synonymous, however, and it is important for students to understand the difference between the two types of research. Simply put, the difference is in whether quantitative and qualitative methods are used together to answer a single research question or not. When data from quantitative and qualitative methods are used together to answer a single research question, a mixed methods approach is employed. In contrast, in a single study that includes both quantitative and qualitative approaches, but those approaches do not answer the same research question, the study should be referred to as multiple methods. An easy way to remember the difference is that in mixed methods research, the results of quantitative and qualitative data collection are mixed together to answer a research question. In a multiple methods study, multiple methods, being quantitative and qualitative methods, are used to answer multiple research questions.
Okay, so that was pretty fast. But hopefully you got all of that. We'll go through it again in a little bit slower way. Okay. So, I mean, without going over everything, it's just kind of a quick review for you here where we talk about, qualitative research, right? That should be quantitative, I think. I wrote the wrong word. Okay, sorry. Let me see. Sorry, a typo. Now you can't see it anyway because it's in red. Oh, wonderful day. Right, this board. Happy days. White. Quantitative. Right, so quantitative research, right, my handwriting is wonderful, as you can tell. Often, right, exhibits features associated with natural science, positivist thinking, right? So it has those empiricist overtones, right? It's about measuring an objective world, a specific problem focus, the hypothesis theory testing kind of aspect we talked about early in the course, right? It's grounded in realism, right? So, it's really, I think, anchored in that kind of realism, right? Okay, yeah. So, we talked about this at the beginning of the course, right? Yeah, sorry.
This is a natural science model and qualitative. Should that also be quantitative?
I believe so. No, where does it say that? I think I just messed this up because I put something over here and then I typed everything wrong. The empiricist overtones, right? Yeah, quantitative, it's quantitative. So it's still quantitative. Yeah. Wait a second. Why am I talking about this? Sorry. That's my brain messed up. Quantitative research audit. Okay, no, I'm sorry. This is, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Well, this should be on two different slides. I am confused by what I wrote here. Sorry. I made this slide like 2 years ago, so I'm a little confused. Okay. Qualitative research often exhibits features associated with natural science. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to erase what I just said. Let me try this again because I got a little confused, and I will. Do I have an eraser? Okay, let's try this again. Forget what I just said, because I understand what I'm saying here. And I've been a fool, Harry Potter, and I will lose. What did I do? Back. Okay. Here's what this is saying, right? Sorry, I'm sorry to confuse me and you. Sometimes qualitative research, right? When we're talking about qualitative research, I should have read this more carefully, does have some features that we would think of as more appropriate to the natural sciences, right? Particularly when we talk about qualitative research and direct observation of nature, right? And here, direct observation of the social world, right? Like say something like ethnography, right? You're anchoring yourself in kind of a direct experience of the social world. Put my pen back. So that should make sense, right? So when we think of, qualitative research, often we are, especially when we talk about ethnography, you're actually in the world and making direct observations of them, right? So it can have, and some people read it as having empiricist overtones, right? That basically, most qualitative research is sort of socially constructivist in its orientation. It can sometimes appear like very direct and scientific because you are kind of anchored in real world observations, like this direct contact with reality, right? Here, procedures in which theories are grounded in data. We're talking about grounded theory, right? So I talked about grounded theory as this process of, in a sense, hypothesis and theory testing, right? Now, it's iterative and it's inductive rather than deductive, which is where it's typically kind of split off from these kind of hard quantitative approaches that are more positivist in nature, but it can have the appearance of it, right? Because you collect your data, you create a hypothesis, and then you go and you test that hypothesis by collecting more data. And only when you get to the point where you have saturation, where you're not getting any new data, do you actually then go and move on and say, like, I think I've understood everything. Okay. So it has these, particular empiricist kind of notions, despite remaining, I think, constructivist in its kind of nature. Some people posit a sort of realism as a middle way between the constructivist and objectivist debates, right? And particularly this idea of critical realism, the notion that there's a social reality that is out there, but it's produced by mechanisms that are real but not directly observable, right? That basically there are a bunch of social forces that sort of create the social world, and that creates a real social world, but it's hard to observe those forces directly. That makes way more sense than what I was saying at the beginning. So, and then what is this from Bashkar? A view of the social world, that the social world is reproduced and transformed in daily life. This is basically Peter Berger's social construction of reality, right? That, if you all took sociology of religion, you all know what I was talking about, but you didn't, so you don't. One of the things that Berger, basically suggests is that in any kind of social world, right, we are shaped by the social world we're born into, right? So we're born into a particular social setting, and that shapes us. But through our daily interactions with it and negotiations with it, we're also able to reshape that social reality, right? Which is why change in human societies is possible, according to Berger, right? It's that there is this kind of push and pull. We both reproduce and transform, the world and the social world in our daily lives, right? So in some ways we support it, right? And in other ways we transform it, which is why some things are the same, and some things ultimately can fundamentally change. Does that make sense now? Did I explain that better? Does it now make sense? Okay. Tripped over myself a little bit. Okay. Yeah, so lots of quantitative researchers are also interested in issues of meaning, right? So I was just describing this study on youth and pornography, right? Where at the end of the day, those researchers were interested in both the correlation between the use of internet pornography by young people and its possible effects on religion and religiosity in those same young people. And, at the end of the day, they said, it looks like there is a correlation between these two factors, but they couldn't tell you why. And they're very interested in why. And basically they said, we hope someone else goes out and does the qualitative work that would tell us a little bit more. Quantitative researchers claim attitudinal questions can access meaning, particularly if respondents are questioned in advance to create survey questions on attitudes, right? So basically what this is saying, right, is if you ask some of those, like, when we were looking at the Likert scales, right, and you ask some of those questions that are like, capitalism is the source of all social problems. Do you strongly agree? To strongly disagree? Right, that this would be, you can access the sort of meaning that people give by asking these kinds of quantitative questions about attitudes, right? Now, what this statement is sort of saying is, if respondents are questioned in advance, like sometimes what this means is if you do like a pilot study to create the questions in a survey, right, you get some kind of base sense of what people's thinking is, and then you can kind of judge how prevalent those attitudes are, what a particular pattern of person might believe. based on some of the questions that you create, right? Which requires you to do a little bit of qualitative work. So yeah, quantitative researchers, right, mostly on the objective, qualitative, claim access to, participants' worldview, but rarely, in the same way, right? But rarely through respondent validation, right? That usually, like, people are trying to reconstruct people's worldview through kind of what they say without being like, so is this your worldview? Is this how you see things, right? Whereas quantitative researchers will ask, like, hey, how much do you agree with this statement, right? It's a little bit different way of accessing it. Like, if I was a qualitative researcher, I'm kind of trying to put together someone's worldview from their interview responses, rather than being like, do you agree that, or not do you agree? I've dinged people for this on the exam and other places. It's like, I don't know, global warming will kill us all, right? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. That would be the kind of way you'd ask it quantitatively. And qualitatively, you'd be like, what do you think about global, climate change and global warming? Tell me, or do you have any concerns about it, right? And then kind of try to break down what they believe based on what they answer. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So there's a lot of, I think, discourse, and I would say I fall into this category of thinking, there's this behavior versus meaning kind of contrast that's been drawn in sociology, right? And in the social sciences in general, where, behavior is the realm of quant and meaning is the realm of qualitative, right? And then there's been this thought that never the twain shall meet, right? We deal with the behavior, you deal with the meaning. But increasingly, I think, anytime you see a hard quant or a hard qual study that doesn't have the other components, you end up missing those bigger pictures, right? And this kind of idea of, numbers versus words, artificial versus natural, these are all distinctions that people have made, essentially in arguments of which of these methods are better, which of them is more rigorous, which one should be used, which one best describes the social world. But I think in all of these cases, each of them, the problem being that each of them only tells us little pieces about the social world and leaves a lot on the table that we don't know, right? So the richer way is to go with both. Okay, so behavior versus meaning. So when we talk about this, right, a lot of perspectives in quantitative social science consider now meaning to be important. And why? Of course, right, if you're, say, looking at a big social pattern, right, like you're looking at, we're talking in my sociology of religion class, the rise of the nuns, not the nuns with the funny hats, the nuns, who consider them, I spell it like this. Sorry, that's an E. My screen shakes when I move it. I used to have the Surface with the kickstand. It was much better for writing on. The nuns, right? These are people who consider, when they answer on a social science survey, what's your religion? They say no religion or nothing in particular, right? We've seen this trend rising in kind of quantitative research for a long time. More and more people identifying as nuns. But yeah, quantitative social science, right, increasingly has been working at getting at the meaning of the nuns. So it's not that meaning is unimportant, right? When it comes to like quantitative social science, you don't want to just describe trends in a lot of cases, because otherwise, right, you don't really get at the nuts and bolts of what's happening in the world because you don't understand the meaning. So I think increasingly more quantitative social scientists are trying to figure out ways of asking quantitative questions that get at meaning a lot better, though it's really, really difficult. And on the same side, right, qualitative researchers often want to know about big level social behaviors, about big social trends, and then try to connect it down to what people actually believe and the meanings that they're making out of things, right? And so I think, when we talk about like both quantitative and qualitative researchers are interested in both kind of aspects. And we've had this kind of privileging in the social sciences for a long time of either you're qual or quant. We have this in the department too. It's kind of funny. Because you'll have people who are very much on one side of the issue or another, and they'll be like, oh, there are too many quant people in the department now. Why did they do it in a British accent? I Can't imagine who would have said that. Do we have any British people in the department? I don't even know. Any professors that sound especially like a Harry Potter character? I can't think of it. Too many quant people, or too many, and the quant scholars being like, no, this department is just entirely qualitative, right? Like, there's no rigor to it. It's all just woofy, floofy garbage. Nobody actually said that. That's me paraphrasing, right? But this division is very artificial in lots of ways, right? Because on both sides, I think people are interested in both kinds of questions, right? Even if they investigate things significantly differently. Okay. Yeah, a lot of quantitative research actually can be, so we drew this distinction at the beginning of the course, right? That quant is deductive in its nature, right? It's about theory testing, right? You come up with a hypothesis, and then you ultimately test that hypothesis with the data, versus the inductive method of qualitative social science, which is like, oh, you gather data and then you create a theory from the data, and then you test it and test it and test it until you get to a point of theoretical saturation, at which point you stop. Okay. When it comes to quantitative researchers, right, this distinction too is a little bit artificial, right? A lot of quantitative research actually can end up being very inductive, right? And certainly, I'm a qualitative researcher by nature, right? More than I am not by nature. I don't know was I born a qualitative researcher? It's a funny thing to say. My inclination as a researcher is much more qualitative than it is quantitative. But I've done quantitative work as well. And I tended to do it much more like almost applying the qualitative sort of inductive way of reasoning into my quantitative work. So when I was doing this one project on Catholics in Edmonton, right? I basically, what I did was I put together a survey, right? That was my first step. I actually put together two surveys, but that's neither here nor there. I didn't have a hypothesis that I had prior to putting together these surveys. What I basically did was I had a research question, right? I had my research question and I had a bunch of things that the person funding the project wanted to know. So I basically created a whole bunch of questions, right? I went to other people's surveys. I took questions that I knew worked. I put them into my survey, and basically just gathered data. And from there, I actually, put together a theory, right? So from that, I was like, okay, this is what I think is going on. And then I did a second survey where I tested a lot of that as well. And then I did a bunch of qualitative work to kind of get at the meaning. But actually, this is, frequent, though I've painted in this class this very, I think, stiff and polished way that quantitative researchers tend to do their work, it's not always like that, right? Like in a lot of cases, people do what I did. And it's like, I have this general research question. I have this area that I'm interested in. I have these research tools that I know how to use, but I don't really know what I'm trying to find. And so then you go and you look at the data and you run a bunch of analyses and try to figure out what's happened, right? And you might not actually come up with your hypothesis until you start testing the data, right? And so when I was doing this, I wasn't running the stats myself because I had a friend who's much better at doing it than me. But, we were running through the stats and doing a bunch of different kind of regressions on the data we got. And then we come up with, oh, I see this in the data. And then I created my theories as to what was going on, which I then wrote in a report and delivered it. And I'm pretty sure the funder buried it in a drawer somewhere and it will never see the light of day, but I'm not bitter. Just because I put in 2 years of work on it, no big deal. Yeah. In a survey, right, the number of potential hypotheses are incredibly vast. And I mean, especially say that you're looking at large data sets, right? Say you take something like the census in Canada or the General Social Survey or the GSS in US or congressional election or comparative election study or monitoring the future or any of 1,000 million bazillion longitudinal big data sets that you can easily get access to. sometimes as a quantitative researcher, you're not going to those data sets with a hypothesis. You're going to those data sets to poke around, right? You load it into SPSS or R, you play around, you see how do these two variables relate to each other, and you kind of play around with the data, and only when you see interesting kind of patterns emerge, do you come up with a hypothesis. So whether you're doing your own research and like creating your own survey or getting, a survey out of these big existing data sets, I think in every case, right, there's a lot of actually this inductive model that goes on in quantitative research. And actually, I think this is where I've had the most fun. It's just downloading a data set like the GSS from NORC and just like playing around with it and seeing what kind of gets spat out. And then being like, oh, I wonder why that correlation is there in the data. And then you come up with a theory and you test it against others and all that fun stuff. I'm sure at some point people are like, why did he take out his pen? I wish he hadn't. Okay. So, numbers versus words, right? And again, this is one of those distinctions that I drew at the beginning of the course, right? That quantitative research is all about numbers, and quantitative research is all about numbers. Qualitative is all about kind of words and how people describe the world. But yeah, I mean, some qualitative researchers do a little bit of quantification, right? Like I've seen people certainly talk about, even like simple things like in 80% of the cases, or 80% of the women that we talked to in this survey said this, right? Or said some version of this, right? So there can be limited degrees of quantification. Use this word or this phrase to describe things. You see a lot of that. So there's quantification in both types, quantitative and qualitative research. And yeah, I mean, sometimes quantitative researchers gather or analyze qualitative data to better understand their subject matter. Even something as simple, right, as an open response box in a survey, right? Where it's like, tell us anything else you think that we should know, right? Technically, like they're involved in some limited degree of qualitative data. So the bright lines that I drew at the beginning of the course, I think don't really do justice to how complex social research is and how much, these two bleed over. Okay. And yeah, artificial versus natural, right? So this is a distinction that, say, doing survey research is very, in a sense, very artificial, right? Because you're putting people into a very artificial environment in doing a survey. So you have more chance of things like social desirability bias. Whereas, say, ethnography especially is much more natural, right? Naturalistic in the sense that it's embedding yourself in the social reality as much as possible. And that's usually the claim, right? Where qualitative researchers will often say that what they're doing is superior. They're saying that it's naturalistic, right? That they're studying people in their natural settings. But qualitative interviewing, right, is definitely not natural. So qualitative isn't always kind of natural, right? When I call people down to do an interview in a conference room at the university or on Zoom or anything, that's obviously not their natural setting. Although sitting in front of your computer for a while seemed like it was all our natural settings. And yeah, participant observation, right? Ethnographies of different kinds can introduce reactivity. So artificiality exists in both of these kinds of research frameworks, right? So it's not just limited to quantitative work. Qualitative work also has this problem that the second you are there or you're asking people to talk to you in a kind of structured way or semi-structured way, you're introducing an element of artificiality even into a natural context. Even something as much as you're wearing a name tag that says researcher on it, right? That introduces an element of artificiality. Okay. Do I want to start into this or should we just... We've got 6 minutes. All right. Maybe this is a good place to start on Tuesday. I'm going to start here, and we'll go from there on Tuesday. We're almost done. We got 2 more topics to cover in the course. We'll finish this, I think, on Tuesday, and from there we will talk a little bit about qualitative analysis, which will be a little bit backwards because we'll go back to qual after talking mixed methods, only because of where the lab sits. And then we'll be done. We're almost done. And if I finish early, I will just cancel the rest of the classes, I promise. I won't make you come and just sit here and watch me do like a puppet show or something. So we might finish a little early in the course, and we'll give you back that time because I'm sure you have nothing else to do. Okay, so yeah, we'll start here on Tuesday. I guess have a great weekend. That's only 5 minutes. Have a great weekend. We'll see you on Tuesday. Yeah, we got like 15 slides. Should be able to get through that quick. Hello.
Some questions about the second major lab.
Second major lab,
Yeah,
not the
just
first
like
one.